It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in San Diego when Jake Raines stepped out of Larson's Hardware, a small mom-and-pop shop nestled on the corner of Hawthorne and 6th. The sun beat down warmly on the asphalt, and the breeze carried the scent of salt from the Pacific nearby. Jake, clad in worn jeans, steel-toed boots, and a nondescript navy hoodie, moved with quiet purpose, a canvas bag of bolts and wood glue in one hand and his truck keys in the other. He looked like any average working man, but the truth of who he was, what he'd endured and accomplished, was buried beneath layers of silence and scars. No one passing by would guess that the man they saw had once crawled through dust and blood-soaked sand in Helmand Province, had lain prone for 36 hours on a wind-scoured cliff in Syria waiting for a single shot, or had been the lone survivor of Operation Grim Tundra, a black op mission so buried even his own family believed it was just another deployment. His record spoke volumes. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, 2 Navy Commendation Medals, and a file so redacted it looked like a crossword puzzle. Yet none of that mattered now, not to the world, not to the city, and certainly not to the 2 young police officers who screeched their cruiser to a halt behind his parked Chevy Silverado just as he reached for the driver's side door handle. In an instant, a normal day twisted into something surreal. Flashing red and blue lights bathed the street in flickering alarm as the sound of boots on pavement echoed behind him. Sharp, aggressive, purposeful, hands where we can see them. Get on the ground, barked a voice filled with more fear than authority. Jake turned, puzzled but unthreatened, instinctively assessing the threat level as his training kicked in like muscle memory. 2 officers, both young, barely older than the recruits he used to train, approached with weapons drawn, their stances rigid and overcompensating. Jake could tell immediately, these weren't bad men, just scared and under pressure, maybe. Still on their first year on the street, he raised his hands slowly, calmly, speaking evenly. I think there's been a mistake, but his words were cut off by the cold metal of handcuffs slapping around his wrists and the shove that bent him over the hot hood of his own truck. The keys in his hand clattered to the ground. He felt the roughness of the engine grill against his chest and heard the sound of phones being pulled out, screens recording, voices murmuring from across the street. Another arrest, someone said. He must have done something. Jake bit his tongue. He could have said 1,000 things, could have listed his rank, his service, the scars on his shoulder from enemy shrapnel, the nights he woke up sweating, from dreams of muzzle flashes and children screaming in foreign dialects, but he knew better. His job had been to move in silence, to work unseen and leave no trace, and old habits die hard. He stayed quiet. You're under suspicion of armed robbery, one of the officers said, voice clipped, as he patted Jake down. Suspect matches your description. Stay quiet. Jake didn't argue, he didn't resist. But inside him, a storm was already brewing. Not of rage, he'd seen too much for that, but of bitter recognition. This country, the one he had served, with his blood, could turn on its own protectors the moment they didn't fit a mold. He wasn't angry at the cops. He was angry at the ease with which the world labeled strangers, how it erased nuance with a glance. He was just a man in a hoodie to them. Another headline waiting to happen. The suspect, it turned out later, was already in custody 2 neighborhoods away, tall, white, tattooed with a teardrop under one eye. But all the officers knew at that moment was that a dark-haired male in jeans and a hoodie had robbed a corner store 6 blocks away, and that was all it took. The people filming had no idea the man they captured had pulled a wounded corpsman out of a burning Humvee under Taliban fire. The teenage girl who uploaded the clip with the caption, "San Diego cops finally doing their job," had no idea that Jake had once taken out a foreign general from 1,800 meters on a windy ridge to prevent a massacre. And the officers, well, they were just doing what they were trained to do in a system that taught them to fear first and ask questions later. Jake's calm demeanor unnerved them more than if he'd resisted. One of them kept glancing at his partner, as if unsure whether they'd just overstepped. "We got the right guy, right?" The younger one muttered under his breath as they loaded Jake into the back of the cruiser. Jake didn't speak. He stared straight ahead, letting the silence speak louder than words. At the station, they led him past rows of desks, eyes following him like he was radioactive. Some recognized something different in him, the way he walked, even in cuffs, with measured control. The sergeant at the front desk furrowed his brow. "He doesn't look like a street thug," he murmured. They took his fingerprints, sat him down in a holding cell. Hours passed. No one offered a phone call. No one asked the right questions. Jake sat there, still as stone, his eyes scanning everything, the locks, the vent above the door, the way the guard tapped his fingers impatiently. He wasn't plotting escape. Old habits. Again, assess, analyze, survive. He remembered a mission in Mosul where he'd been trapped behind enemy lines for 12 hours in a cellar with a broken radio and a bleeding leg. That had been harder than this, but this felt different. It felt wrong, and deeply personal. He could handle pain. What he struggled with was the sheer disregard. It wasn't the arrest. It was the indifference. The assumption that he was just another lowlife. It hurt more than the bullet he took in Ramadi. Across the room, a wall-mounted TV played muted news footage of a congressional hearing on veteran benefits. Jake chuckled bitterly. The irony was surgical. They talked about honoring service while handcuffing heroes who looked suspicious. Eventually, a female officer walked in holding a folder and an iPad. She looked unsure. "Mr. Rains?" she asked. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Jacob Rains," she repeated, slower now. "Former Navy sniper." Jake nodded once. The room grew still. She turned to the desk sergeant and whispered something, and he stood upright like someone had just dumped ice water down his back. Files were pulled. A background check ran, and then the atmosphere shifted. You could feel it, guilt and panic replacing confidence. But Jake didn't say, "I told you so." He simply stared at the wall as if waiting for the rest of the system to catch up with his dignity. Somewhere outside, a black SUV rolled toward the station, carrying a man with stars on his shoulders and fury in his chest. But that was yet to come. For now, Jake sat alone in a cold metal cell, still in cuffs, still seen as a threat, still carrying a truth that no one had bothered to ask about, that sometimes the most dangerous man in the room isn't the one shouting or fighting, but the one who's been trained never to break even when the whole damn world tries to misunderstand him. The hours in the holding cell dragged like days, and for Jacob Rains, each tick of the wall clock was not just a measurement of time, but a reminder of the slow erosion of dignity, a slow burn of injustice, eating through a man who had been trained to carry pain like armor. His hands had long gone numb from the cold steel of the handcuffs. His wrists pressed against the steel bench behind him as he leaned slightly back. His breathing measured, his heart rate steady, trained after years of combat to suppress panic, fear, and emotion under a surface of absolute control. But beneath that calm exterior, something old and buried stirred, not fury, not vengeance, but a deeper ache, something more bitter and cold, betrayal. He had always known the country he served was imperfect, but today the cracks were up close and personal. The holding cell smelled of disinfectant, sweat, and dried coffee. Somewhere down the hallway, a copy machine clicked and hummed as if nothing seismic was happening in this corner of the precinct. The guards didn't look at him anymore. Earlier, one had even laughed with another, joking about how suspects always claimed to be veterans or war heroes. Had one last week said he was in Delta Force. The officer had said, "Dude barely knew how to spell Delta." They laughed then, but Jake wasn't laughing. He stared forward, muscles relaxed, face unreadable, just like when he'd lain camouflaged in the side of a mountain. Wind whistling past his cheek while he stared down the scope of his M40A5, waiting for a kill order that might never come. But this wasn't Afghanistan. This was San Diego, and this was supposed to be home. Then, finally, something shifted. The lock on the far door buzzed, and in walked a young officer, mid-twenties, fresh buzzcut, uniform crisp, holding a folder that seemed to weigh more with each step he took toward Jake's cell. The man looked confused, even nervous, as if he had just been handed something radioactive. He hesitated outside the bars, cleared his throat, and asked, "Sir, is your name Jacob Rains, Petty Officer, First Class?" Jake slowly turned his head, locked eyes with the young man, and gave a single nod. A pause followed. The officer blinked. "You single quotes, the Jacob Rains?" he asked, his voice thinning under the pressure of dawning realization. "Silver Star recipient. 2 tours in Afghanistan, Navy Cross consideration." Again, Jake nodded, colder this time, the weight of restrained pride sitting heavy on his chest. The officer stared down at the folder. Inside were printed citations, incident reports, and one picture of Jake in dress blues standing beside Admiral Lockhart during a medal ceremony, his face still as stone even back then. The young cop's jaw tightened, and color drained from his face. "Sir, I think we've made a terrible mistake." He began fumbling with his radio, speaking quickly into the mic on his shoulder. And within minutes, the energy inside the precinct shifted like a tectonic plate. First it was murmurs, officers glancing toward the holding area, whispers exchanged, eyebrows raised, and movement. A sergeant stepped out of his office, red-faced, shouting for someone to recheck the arrest file. A lieutenant scrambled to call dispatch. The arresting officers were pulled aside, their expressions falling from proud to pale as they realized who they had put in cuffs just hours earlier. The man they'd treated like a suspect, searched, and thrown in a cage had been a ghost story in their training manuals. A living legend whispered about in boot camp, the kind of operator whose file had more black ink than text, the kind of man who could take out a vehicle engine from half a mile while adjusting for wind drift. But now that man was sitting on a steel bench behind bars, humiliated, forgotten, processed like a criminal. And as the storm of panic rippled through the station, Jake remained still, silent, watching the chaos he didn't ask for unfold around him. One officer approached to uncuff him, nervously saying, "Sir, we're going to get this straightened out." But Jake simply extended his wrists without a word. And when the cuffs fell away with a click, he rubbed the red marks silently and stood to his full height, taller, broader, and more commanding than anyone in that room had realized. For a moment, no one knew what to do. The balance of power had shifted. A man they'd dismissed had turned into a mirror reflecting their deepest assumptions and failures. Jake could have walked out, could have yelled, could have demanded lawyers and reporters, but instead, he looked around, his eyes resting briefly on each man and woman who had been part of the mistake, not with contempt, but with something worse, quiet disappointment. "I asked for a phone call," Jake said, finally, breaking his silence. 4 hours ago, the room fell into guilty stillness. And then just when it seemed the full reckoning had arrived, the outer doors of the precinct flew open, and in walked a man who brought with him the weight of the US military itself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a full-dress Navy uniform adorned with ribbons that glittered like medals in a museum, each one hard-earned over decades of leadership. His posture was absolute, his jaw clenched tight beneath salt-and-pepper hair trimmed with regulation precision. It was General Marcus Ellison, commander of U.S. Special Operations Command, a 4-star general with direct ties to every Black Ops unit in the field and a personal relationship with every sniper who had ever made a real difference overseas. And he was furious. The double doors slammed behind him like a gavel in a courtroom, and the entire station fell into silence. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Chairs squeaked as officers stood instinctively, unsure if they should salute or stay still. The general marched past the front desk, past the startled watch sergeant, past the precinct captain who tried to step forward, only to be met with a curt stand down. His eyes scanned the room until they locked onto Jake, and then without hesitation he strode across the floor and opened the gate to the holding wing himself. Not a word spoken yet. The general walked up to Jake, stopped at a distance of 3 feet, and looked him dead in the eyes. His voice, when it came, was low, grave, and carried the full authority of a man who had seen empires crumble and rebuild. "Petty Officer Rains," he said, "you have failed today." Jake didn't move. His eyes flickered with recognition, but he didn't blink. The general's expression softened, just slightly. "We all swore to protect this country. You did that with honor. Today you were treated like a criminal by the very system you defended." There was silence. Then, stunning everyone, the general straightened, raised his hand, and saluted. The room froze. Time paused. A 4-star general saluting a man who had just been in handcuffs. Jake returned the salute slowly, deliberately, not out of protocol but out of shared understanding. The general then turned to the officers in the room, eyes blazing. "I want every record of this arrest scrubbed and sealed. I want a personal apology from this department, in writing, on my desk by morning, and I want a damn explanation for how this happened. We don't destroy our own." He paused, then added, "You handcuffed a war hero. That is a stain on every one of us." He placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, and for the first time that day, Jake exhaled. The general led him out of the precinct like a lion walking beside another, the atmosphere behind them thick with shame and silence. As they reached the doors, Jake turned to the young officer who had realized the mistake and nodded once. A gesture that said, "You're young, you saw the truth. Remember this." And then they were gone out into the California sunlight, leaving behind a precinct that would never forget the day they learned the hard way that not every man in a hoodie is a suspect. Sometimes, he's a legend just trying to buy some glue and bolts on a Tuesday afternoon. The next morning, the world knew Jacob Rains not as the suspect in custody from a blurry cell phone video, but as the man who had been wrongfully handcuffed by his own countrymen and personally vindicated by a 4-star general in a moment now etched into digital history. The scene, caught on precinct security footage and leaked by an anonymous officer, spread like wildfire across social media and cable news. igniting a storm of questions about how easily even America's most decorated warriors could be mistaken for criminals in a system that too often failed to pause before judging, too often blurred the line between caution and profiling. Jake, who had never asked for the spotlight, found himself buried in it. As talk shows debated what had happened, some expressing outrage, others tiptoeing around the issue with hollow professionalism, but Jake wasn't watching. He sat on the back porch of his modest home just outside San Diego, sipping black coffee from a chipped Navy mug, his shepherd, Ghost, lying silently by his boots, the morning sun casting long, golden streaks across the wooden planks of the deck he'd built himself over the summer. He wasn't angry, not in the way people expected, but he was unsettled, not just by what happened at the station, but by the fact that it hadn't shocked him. Somewhere deep down, he had always known that his service didn't come with immunity from suspicion, that the camouflage he wore overseas became invisibility the moment he stepped back onto American streets. And for all the flag-waving and Veterans Day commercials, the truth was simple. Once you're out, you're forgotten. Unless the world decides you're useful again, useful for headlines, outrage, or redemption stories. The general had called him the night before, not as a superior officer but as a brother-in-arms, asking if he was all right and if there was anything he needed. Jake had told him, with the same calm certainty he'd used to call in Overwatch. "Coordinates, I'm fine, sir, I've handled worse, but I appreciate what you did." The general had paused on the other end, voice softening as he replied, "You shouldn't have had to handle it at all. That meant something, not everything, but something." Now sitting on his porch, Jake watched the world react. Veterans groups rallied behind him, some organizing peaceful marches calling for reform and better awareness of how law enforcement interacted with prior service members. Others wrote letters to Congress demanding training programs that taught officers to recognize signs of military trauma and identity, not to make veterans untouchable but to make them visible, to acknowledge their humanity beyond assumptions. Meanwhile, at the San Diego Police Department, the fallout was immediate and unrelenting. The precinct commander gave a press conference filled with stiff apologies and carefully scripted remorse, flanked by city officials who spoke of unfortunate incidents and commitments to re-evaluation. But Jake had heard such words before in village negotiations overseas. In military briefings after a drone strike went wrong. He knew the difference between sincerity and optics. He didn't care for public shaming. What he cared about was change, not for him, but for the next guy who walked down the street in a hoodie with a past the world couldn't see. One of the officers who had arrested him, Officer Kendrick, the younger one, showed up at Jake's house that afternoon, hat in hand, literally, standing awkwardly on the sidewalk as Jake sat silently, ghost watching like a sphinx. "I came to apologize," Kendrick said, voice low, eyes not quite meeting Jake's. "I made a mistake. I saw the hoodie. I saw your stance. I didn't see the man." Jake looked at him for a long moment, then motioned for him to come closer, not as a threat, but with calm command. Kendrick stepped forward, heart pounding. "You're not the first to make that mistake," Jake said, "but if you want to make it right, don't just apologize. Educate the others. Change something. Speak when they stay silent." Kendrick nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Yes, sir," he said instinctively, and Jake almost smiled at that almost. That night, Jake received a letter, not digital, but handwritten in careful, deliberate script. It was from the daughter of the store clerk who had actually been robbed during the incident that led to Jake's arrest. "My father says he's sorry they dragged someone innocent in," the girl wrote. "He said the man who did it looked nothing like you. I don't know why they said you matched. My dad says thank you for staying calm and being better than the system." Jake folded the letter and tucked it into the pages of a worn copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, the same book he had carried with him on deployments, rain-soaked and scribbled in, a reminder that stoicism wasn't about silence, it was about control, about choosing when and how to react. The next few weeks were a blur of interviews, legal meetings, and well-meaning offers, TV appearances, speaking tours, book deals, but Jake declined them all. "This isn't a brand," he told one agent. "This was my Tuesday." Still, he agreed to one interview with a quiet, principled, veteran-run podcast called Echoes of Service, hosted by a former Marine named Sosa, a man who had lost his leg in Iraq and gained a deeper view of the world. During the episode, Jake told the whole story not with bitterness, but with clarity. He spoke of the arrest, the humiliation, the general's apology, but also about the deeper issue, how easily veterans are categorized once they remove the uniform, how they're very disciplined, they are trained for come under pressure. Eyes always scanning can be misread as menace by people who have never seen war, never understood what it does to your gait, your silence, your gaze. The episode went viral, not because it was explosive but because it was raw, honest, and undramatized. For the first time, people didn't see Jake as a symbol, they saw him as a man. Meanwhile, General Ellison met with the mayor and local PD leadership, not as a politician but as a soldier, insisting on a pilot program he dubbed Shield to Street, where law enforcement cadets would be required to attend joint workshops with veterans organizations, learning how to de-escalate with empathy, how to spot signs of PTSD, how to see the full picture instead of a silhouette in motion. Jake was invited to attend the first session. He stood before 30 cadets, all in fresh uniforms, and told them, "Every person you meet has a past. Most of it is invisible. Some of it is sacred. Your badge gives you power, but never let it make you blind. A mistake in war can cost you a life. A mistake on patrol can cost someone their humanity." They listened. He could see it in their faces. Some took notes. Others just sat quietly, absorbing the presence of a man who had survived more than most of them would ever imagine. When the session ended, several approached him not to shake hands, but to ask questions, real ones, about restraint, about trauma, about how to recognize when someone wasn't a threat, just tired. Jake answered them all, not like a superior but like a mentor. Afterward, outside the academy building, he stood alone for a moment, watching the sun begin to dip beyond the city skyline. That was when Kendrick approached him again, not in uniform this time, but in jeans and a sweatshirt, looking more human, more humble. "I'm applying to transfer to community engagement," he said. "You lit a fire under some of us." Jake nodded. "Just keep it burning," he said. The months rolled on, the headlines faded. Other scandals took the spotlight, but the impact remained. Jake was invited to quietly consult on policy with state lawmakers. The precinct that arrested him now hosted quarterly trainings with veteran organizations. And though Jake never sought recognition, one day a letter arrived, bearing the presidential seal. It read, in part, "In a moment when you could have chosen anger, you chose grace. In a country where justice sometimes stumbles, you reminded us what quiet strength looks like." Jake didn't frame the letter. He didn't need to. He'd never fought for praise. He'd fought for peace. He'd fought for peace, and finally, in his own quiet way, he had made a dent in the chaos. One morning, almost a year to the day since the arrest, Jake visited a military cemetery just outside town. He walked the rows of stones silently, ghost padding beside him, stopping at a grave marked with a familiar name, Ramirez, his spotter. "Kia, Kandahar." Jake placed a coin on the marker, took a knee, and whispered, "We're still fighting, brother. But this time, it's different." The breeze stirred, and for a moment he felt a weight lift, not completely, but enough to walk forward into the day, because he knew now his mission wasn't over. It had just changed its battlefield.